Welcome to Great Minds with Michael Medved.
It's conventional wisdom that science and religion represent two disconnected extremes, but if they don't connect, that makes for bad science,
A production of the Discovery Institute.
and bad religion.
On this episode,
What about the indication of a dangerous consensus? One of them that you described is when a consensus is widely proclaimed before it even really exists.
That's right. I mean, if you look back at the 1970s and the news stories and the cover stories about global cooling, they claimed we were probably going to move into a new ice age. Immediately, the stories say things like scientists generally agree. Okay, in fact, that itself, when you hear, rather than this particular scientist argues this, you hear that science says, or scientists agree in the abstract, that itself is usually a little fishy.
that and more on this episode of Great Minds with Michael Medved. Here's Michael.
One of the things about cliches is they become cliches for a reason. Usually they express some kind of profound truth. What about that cliche that says, great minds think alike? Well, that's not always so great, is it? Scientific consensus, so-called, it can be dangerous. That's why on this edition of Great Minds with Michael Medved, I'm glad to speak with Jay Richards. Jay is the author of many books, including The Human Advantage, which is coming out in June. He and I are both involved with the Discovery Institute, where we try to bring a very diverse array of guests who don't necessarily think alike and who certainly don't necessarily feel the same way about the idea of consensus in the sciences. Jay, you've just written a very controversial piece for American Enterprise Institute, which people, by the way, can read for themselves on our website, mindswithmedved.com. That's mindswithmedved.com. The basic argument of the piece is that scientific consensus can actually be dangerous.
It can.
All right. So let's make clear from the outset, this doesn't mean that all scientific consensus is out the window.
Absolutely.
For instance, I do have to share this with you because we did Conspiracy Day. We do Conspiracy Day every month. This last Conspiracy Day, we were dominated by callers who were questioning the scientific consensus that rejects a flat Earth. They believe there's a whole movement out there. It's all over the internet.
I've seen this.
Okay. This is not a dangerous scientific consensus, is there? By the way, there is consensus that the Earth is round.
Absolutely. I mean, the thing about the consensus that the Earth is round is not a modern scientific consensus. Educated people in the West have known this at least since Aristotle. And so it's not like this is not a conspiracy from the 1970s.
By the way, do you have any sense what is going on? There were seemingly sane-sounding people who were calling the show one after another, who were talking about the Earth is flat.
I think what's happening is this is the long tail of the information superhighway. We are highly connected, and so one kind of crazy crank that would just be talking to himself can create an audience, right? And so it's 1 out of a million people that listen to him. But this is one of the costs of our connectivity is that these very strange sort of habits and intellectual proclivities can sort of find a life of their own. I don't think this one is likely to live very long, but you're absolutely right. I mean, of course, for most things, right, we have to trust the experts. And so we trust the experts simply because we live in an age of specialization and because sometimes things are right, that people agree with something because they've come to general agreement, they've looked at the evidence, and they made a rational decision. That's one type of consensus. But consensus can also just mean group opinion or groupthink. In other words, for some non-rational or sociological reason, a group of experts decide that they're going to take one side in some kind of controversial issue. And so my question in this piece is essentially, okay, if you're a non-expert on some scientific topic and you want to know, okay, I hear there's a consensus on this topic, when should I feel confident, that, I think what they're telling me is probably true? And are there conditions under which you should be justified in being skeptical, even if you don't know anything about the details of the science?
And this is what I find fascinating in the piece, is you have a list of a series of tells that indicate that you ought to question the consensus. And, of course, the consensus that you've questioned most controversially is the consensus about climate change.
Right.
Now, you don't doubt that climate change is occurring.
No, of course not. And that's sort of the first tell. I say when the issue bundles completely unrelated and distinct issues together as if they're all about the same thing. So if people ask, people ask me, do you believe in climate change? Well, what does this mean? Exactly. Of course. I mean, any place you live, the climate changes. Well, it turns out that climate change really is a stand-in phrase for 4 different issues. And it's really, are we in a warming trend globally, right? So is the Earth warming over time? Are human beings the primary cause of it? That's a different question. You've got what's happening and what's causing it. That's just logic to distinguish those. Is it bad? In other words, is the warming that we see, is it on balance a good or a bad thing? That's the normative question. And then you've got really the political question. Okay, what policies would actually even make a difference, even if all these things were occurring? Very often, though, when you're asked about climate change, you're supposed to sign off on all those 4 completely different issues. And when you try to separate them, as I've discovered myself, you get called a denier. Even if you say, look, I actually think we're in a warming trend. I think that it's quite likely human beings contribute something to the change in the environment in all sorts of ways. And I'm open to the possibility it could be bad if it continued. That doesn't tell you anything about whether the Kyoto Protocol or the Paris Climate Agreement would do anything about it. And we need to be able to have a rational discussion. When people want to take an issue, bundle separate issues together as if they're all one question, that's a sign that maybe something's happening.
You also say that another sign is when ad hominem attacks proliferate about people who question the consensus. Have you been subject to some
Absolutely. In fact, right now, probably if someone checks my bio at Wikipedia, it's going to probably say I'm a climate denier. I mean, the very word denier is itself an ad hominem. Now, of course, in every debate, we're human beings. We have a tendency to attack the people we disagree with rather than our arguments. But when ad hominems are the beginning of the argument, that can be a tell that people don't actually have really good and persuasive arguments that they can present to you. And so you essentially try to demonize the opposition. And if large numbers of influential people can do that, you can essentially kind of silence the dissenting voices.
Okay, you will agree that on some consensuses, like we were speaking before briefly about the Earth is round consensus.
That's right.
Ad hominem attacks might be appropriate on some of the people who are questioning that?
It certainly makes sense, but we don't even need to do that because there's so many very good arguments, actually very intuitively plausible arguments for this.
Better to even avoid.
Yes, exactly.
Are you crazy?
Yeah, I mean that's right. And of course there are things like that, but something like climate change, which is what I focus on in this piece, climate change is nothing like that. I mean, in principle, does the idea that we have such profound and detailed knowledge of what the climate is going to do, it's doing now, that we can predict the global temperature 50 years out, does that even sound like the kind of thing on which there could be certainty in the same way that, say, the shape of the Earth could come to certainty, or our knowledge of chemistry and the makeup of the periodic table? Those are the kinds of things in which you can imagine what experiments and observations would make us certain. What's going to happen in the global climate 50 years hence? That sounds like something that is just kind of intrinsically something we ought to be tentative about in our conclusions.
Okay, one of the other aspects that you say is that when scientists themselves are pressured to toe a party line, that's another indication of a dangerous consensus.
That's right. And so how do you know when you see that? One sign is when well-placed scientists, when they become emeritus, in other words, when they retire, suddenly start talking about these things or suddenly do it when they're in a very safe position. So you don't get too many young scientists that are waiting for tenure talking about these things. You get people like Richard Lindzen, who's a meteorologist and a climate scientist at MIT, right? A very safe guy in a safe position. When he's senior in his position and can't, really no one can harm him. When scientists suddenly start talking in heterodox ways that are in that position, that's usually a sign that normal science in some ways is breaking down. In other words, the normal type of scientific debate that you ought to have and often do have in science maybe is breaking down. And I think that's absolutely the case if you look at the details around the climate debate.
Okay, what about the indication of a dangerous consensus? One of them that you describe is when consensus is widely proclaimed before it even really exists.
That's right. I mean, if you look back at the 1970s and the news stories and the cover stories about global cooling at the time, you can pull these up online, stories in Time and Newsweek that claimed we were probably going to move into a new ice age. Immediately, the stories say things like scientists generally agree. Okay, in fact, that itself, when you hear, rather than this particular scientist argues this, you hear that science says, or scientists agree in the abstract, that itself is usually a little fishy. Or when consensus seems to happen right at the beginning. I mean, this happened with Al Gore. As long as he has been talking about this issue, he said there was an absolute scientific consensus, though later he spoke about a time 15 years in the past in which there was still a debate. Though if you go back and look at what Al Gore was saying on that date, he had already claimed there was a consensus.
Yeah, he proclaimed the debate was over,
yes.
I think, when he was 15.
Right, yeah, no, yeah, exactly. I mean, it very early on, he claimed, look, no rational person should be arguing about this.
Okay, that's another indication when basically isn't it when the whole premise is that rationality demands only one answer. The one point that I wanted to get to is, can you think of any predictive thrust that people could absolutely rely on for 50 years in the future about the condition of man?
No. I mean, that's precisely right. The point is the sort of thing that just doesn't seem to submit to that level of certainty. And then if you actually look at the scientific models that have tried to simulate the future environment, just look at them, pull them up online. There are about 44 major models. They all predict 2 to 3 times the rate of warming that's actually being observed. So if we're going to be honest, what that means is that these are crummy models. They're not working. We need to rework them so that they fit the observational data. But what's happening instead is people are preferring the models to the actual observations. That's just not how science is supposed to work.
What about the predictions about population growth, unbridled population growth? How do those look for our long-term future?
I mean, it's crazy. We're all hearing this, right? And now even the UN says that by about 2050, the human population is going to level off. Though Paul Ehrlich is still somehow managing to get paid with these predictions of overpopulation. The reality is that if you look at human population, we had exponential growth right at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. The reason more people could eat, so they didn't die, they survived. And then countries become highly industrialized, and for whatever reasons, good, bad, or indifferent, they start having fewer and fewer kids. That's the real worry. And yet, in some ways, the kind of climate debate still creates this hysteria for things like human population growth, which is, if it was ever a problem, it hasn't been a problem for decades.
When the subject matter seems by its nature to resist real consensus,
yes,
that's another indication that you specify for a false and a dangerous consensus.
It is.
Explain.
If you're talking about experimental science, what experimental science is about is you set up an experiment under very precise conditions, you run the experiments, and you report both the setup and the results. And in principle, you make it public, you publish it in a peer-reviewed journal, and it ought to be replicated. It ought to be replicatable. Those are the kinds of things on which now there's only a few things that will submit to that rigor, but we can get certainty when you can do that. When you're talking about the future of the climate, in which virtually all of our knowledge about what the climate is going to do in the future is based not on observations, it's based on computer models that rely for their data on the variables that are plugged in by the scientists themselves. When you are told that there's certainty on something like that doesn't seem to submit to that level of certainty, that's a very strong sign, I think, that you ought to be suspicious.
Okay, I think most people can probably agree, based on what you're saying right now, Jay Richards, that some of the false consensus is obnoxious and it's discouraging.
Right.
But why is it dangerous?
Well, it's dangerous because really, if this was just a sort of philosophical debate, right, that didn't touch our day-to-day lives, it wouldn't matter. But remember that the reason people are so intense about the climate issue, that they have bumper stickers on their car about the issue, is they think, first of all, that the human race is in danger. And what is the proposed solution? Always. The proposed solution is always political control over the economy, increased control at the national level or at the transnational level with the UN of the political machine of the state controlling our everyday lives. And that's always what the proposed solution is. That's very high cost. Now, we want the state to do certain things, but because the state has a form of a sort of monopoly on coercion and violence, we want it only to have jurisdiction over certain kinds of things and not other kinds of things. And so to justify essentially a massive reworking of the global economy on something that's actually not anywhere near as certain as the supposed experts are telling us, that makes it relevant. That makes it dangerous, and it makes it it makes it matter to us in a way that, a debate about the nature of some distant star does not. That's an interesting philosophical or scientific question, but it doesn't bear on our day-to-day lives.
What about you in your other life? You teach business and
Yeah.
economics. You're a big advocate of free markets.
Yes.
How can free markets possibly deal with global warming, with climate change, if the non-existent consensus actually is right, that it is catastrophic?
Yeah.
How is it possible for free markets to cope?
Well, I think this is the real issue. I mean, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that it is catastrophic and then we're causing it. Then the question is, okay, how would we actually solve this? We're not going to get India and China to quit producing carbon dioxide and building coal-fired plants. And so my question is, okay, so you can either mitigate, right, or you can adapt. No political solution that anyone has ever proposed makes any sense. In fact, the EPA's own estimate, the pre-Trump EPA's estimate of the effects of the Paris Treaty, if it were fully complied with, would be a diminishing amount of reduction in warming even 100 years out. So in other words, trillions of dollars for absolutely no effect. On the other hand,
maybe just slowing it by a couple of months.
It's essentially out at 2100. It's 0.17 degrees Celsius reduction in warming. So we couldn't even detect it. On the other hand, what we do know is that the wealthier you are, the more likely you are to be able to adapt to any kind of change or perturbation. The wealthy those of us in the West, if the weather gets really bad in the climate in a particular place, we'll just move, right? But the poor in the developing world can't do that. So the poor are always going to be the ones that are most affected by whatever happens. And so my argument, just as the Danish statistician Bjorn Lomborg argues, is that what we need to be focusing on is development, on helping the rest of the world get as wealthy as we are. Because if the world is much more developed 50 or 100 years from now, we're going to be able to adapt much better to whatever the changes are in the climate or whatever. And I think that ought to be the real lesson. Even if you're really, really worried, even if you're a catastrophist, if you look at the real policies that are proposed, they're utterly inadequate. Unless we're actually going to just dismantle modern civilization, what we really need is development. And we know just since 1990, over 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty in what we used to call the third world, not because of anything the UN did, but because of enterprise, because of property rights, because of widening circles of trade, and because of innovation. In fact, the UN itself thinks that within 30 years, we may eradicate absolute poverty. I think whatever your view on the details of climate change, that's really what we ought to be focusing on.
And part of that process involves some of this progress that's very dramatic on desalinization.
Yes, absolutely.
Because one of the things that people do talk about is water shortages everywhere. So if they could convert seawater, now this may sound very simple-minded, but if you actually are having rising sea levels, but you're able to desalinize, you're able to use a great deal of that seawater, divert it to watering crops and to keeping people alive.
Right.
Doesn't that sort of bode well for dealing with any crisis?
It does. And of course, the thing we haven't talked about, and this is non-controversial, but carbon dioxide is plant food, right? Remember, plants like carbon dioxide. We breathe it out, they breathe it in. Just since 1980, in fact, this is a well-established science, we've actually increased the greening of the world, the so-called leaf area index. It's measured by satellites of the Earth about 14%. And it's
since 1980?
Yes, since 1980. This is widely, not widely known, but well understood in the
So what about the disappearing rainforest?
Well, you see that, of course, on the edges, that's happening. But even if you look at the leaf area index, and I encourage people to Google this, even the Sahara is shrinking. And most of this is thought to be the result of what's called aerial fertilization. The more carbon dioxide essentially in the atmosphere, the better plants do. This is a very well understood process. And so there could be negative consequences to increases in carbon dioxide, including the effects on climate. But don't forget that there's also these added benefits. And so those are the sorts of things that we tend to forget about.
It is true, isn't it, that the United States is more forested than it was in 1900?
Absolutely. And then this is the ironic thing is that the more productive we get in farming, the more land we can use for other things, either allow it to be a wilderness or a nature park or whatever. I mean, I think that's actually where we're going in terms of agriculture. And so the reality is that in long term, innovation and efficiency are the way to actually preserve the environment and to be good stewards. The problem is there's so much hysteria over this climate change issue that it's really hard to have prudential discussions about what the kind of best policies would be.
Well, certainly it's hard unless you recognize that there are dangers to false scientific consensus. If you want to learn more about Dr. Richard's work, if you want to read his essay about how you know when a consensus is false and dangerous, go find it at our website, mindswithmedved.com. That's mindswithmedved.com. And do find out all about our upcoming programs, our upcoming discussions, because producing this kind of conversation isn't an entirely free process. It is funded by you. So be part of that process. Go to mindswithmedved.com and tune in for the very next episode of Great Minds with Michael Medved. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for listening to Great Minds with Michael Medved, available at mindswithmedved.com. Great Minds with Michael Medved is produced by Jeremy Steiner and Greg Tomlin and is copyrighted by Discovery Institute 2018. Welcome to Great Minds with Michael Medved.
It's conventional wisdom that science and religion represent two disconnected extremes, but if they don't connect, that makes for bad science,
A production of the Discovery Institute.
and bad religion.
On this episode,
How did the Nazi fascination with, an obsession with eugenics, of proper breeding to build a better kind of human being, how did that initiate?
The whole movement of eugenics began through Francis Galton, who was Darwin's cousin, and he got the idea while he was reading Darwin's Origin of Species. He says this himself. If there's this struggle for existence going on and there's all these variations that are out there, that we as humans now have the ability to choose which variations should survive. And so we can choose the traits we want.
Horses.
Sure, exactly. That's exactly what they said, yeah. And Darwin himself said this about we wouldn't even leave to chance the way we do with breeding humans, our breeding of animals.
that and more on this episode of Great Minds with Michael Medved. Here's Michael.
Welcome to Great Minds with Michael Medved, where we explore great questions with great thinkers and struggle, maybe even, to provide some great answers. Visit our website, mindswithmedved.com, for more information about this program and to subscribe to future episodes. Now, one question that ends up fascinating so many people in so many different disciplines, historians and philosophers and scientists and psychologists, is where did Adolf Hitler come from? He was not simply a lunatic, nor did he suddenly emerge full-grown onto the stage of world history out of absolutely nowhere. He had a background. He had roots. He came from an intellectual milieu. And historian Richard Weikert explores those origins of Hitler's thinking and his monstrous evil in his book, From Darwin to Hitler, Evolutionary Ethics, Eugenics, and Racism in Germany. Dr. Weikert joins us today to talk about Hitler's intellectual and philosophical background. Richard is a professor of modern European history at California State University, Stanislaus. Professor Weikert, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
It's a great pleasure. First question would be, you have explored a series of cheerful and, of course, innocuous topics in your books. The roots of Hitler's thinking, his religion, your other cheerful title, The Death of Humanity. What has inspired your particular interest in this direction of academic investigation?
Yeah, interesting. I came in from a back door because I wasn't really, when I was doing my grad studies, I wasn't really that interested in studying the Nazi period. I thought pretty much a lot had already been said. I didn't think I had anything particular to contribute to it. But as I began doing my dissertation research on the reception of Darwinism by German socialists in the late 19th century, I noticed that there were some German Darwinists who were wanting to replace Judeo-Christian ethics with evolutionary ethics. And so I got interested in that topic of evolutionary ethics. And as I began exploring the issue of evolutionary ethics in the late 19th century and early 20th century in Germany, I started finding that the people who were promoting evolutionary ethics at that time were people who were also promoting eugenics, that is the idea to try to engineer better humans to improve human heredity, and also people who were promoting euthanasia, scientific racism, and other kinds of things that sounded to me pretty similar to Nazi ideology. And so that sort of sparked my attention and got me interested in trying to see if there really were links between them. I didn't start this project, determined to draw links between these two things. It just sort of came out of the investigation and research.
You use the term evolutionary ethics. Did Darwin ever use that term?
No, Darwin didn't use the term, but Darwin did believe that ethics and morality had evolved, and he does talk about that extensively in his book, The Descent of Man. So there's actually two different ways that evolutionary ethics was used, both in the 19th century and also even more recently. One way is the notion that simply that morality evolved, and Darwin clearly did believe that. He believed that there were what he called social instincts. He uses that term to describe what he sees as instincts of compassion and solidarity with other people, and he thought this was also true in wolf packs and other social animals and such. And so the notion that morality has evolved was one key idea, and this is an idea that I do discuss extensively from Darwin to Hitler, and that interestingly that Hitler also believed in. The second idea of evolutionary ethics, though, is the idea that whatever promotes evolution is ethical. So you try to advance human evolution, that is the good. That is what you're trying to pursue. And Hitler also believed in that form of evolutionary ethics.
Well, when you talk about evolutionary ethics, I mean, obviously the great virtue is survival. And people understand that we believe that the popular sort of reduction of evolution and natural selection is survival of the fittest. Does that comport with some of the ideas that were imported from Darwin to Hitlerism?
Well, that's a great question because, interestingly, Darwin himself understood that the notion of progress really didn't fit his theory particularly well. At times in his notebooks he writes about this and such. But then if you actually read Origin of Species, Descent of Man, and a lot of other German Darwinists, they talk about progress all the time. They talk about higher species, lower species, and such. And so there was this notion that there was this progress that was taking place, and not just in the physical realm or in the mental realm even, but in the moral realm, so that they thought that there was moral progress that was going on in the evolutionary progress. So technically, a lot of biologists, and even today, will pull back and say, no, there's no such thing as progress in any of these things taking place. But the truth is that in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, many Darwinists did believe that there was some kind of progress taking place, including moral progress, and so they sort of built this into their theory. So even though technically people say, well, there's no teleology in Darwinism, in fact, they still did try to fudge with it a lot of times by seeing there being progress.
Okay, when you talk about progress and evolution, did Darwin believe that the races of human beings had evolved differently and at different times?
Clearly, he believed that there were higher and lower races, and he uses that terms. And he also uses terms like savages to describe sometimes what he considered the lower races. But there's an interesting section in The Descent of Man. The section is called On the Extinction of Human Races, where he discusses the fact that he believes that certain races, such as the Europeans, were bettering, and that is actually exterminating, driving to extinction, other races such as the Tasmanians, Australian Aborigines, and such. And so built into his theory was this idea that races are sort of subspecies that are in competition within the struggle for existence, and that some are going to go extinct. And even there's a passage, I think it's in one of the later editions, maybe the second edition or later, of The Descent of Man, where he actually says that as the lower human races become extinct, this is going to widen the gulf between apes and humans.
Widen the gulf between apes and humans. Now, did Darwin believe that there were certain races, because certainly Hitler did, that were closer to apes than other races?
Yes, clearly, and that's why he thought it was going to widen the gap, because he thought the so-called primitive races, or the lower races, he did believe were lower. And interestingly, in relation to the evolutionary ethics issue that I raised, he also believed they were morally inferior to the Europeans. And he makes this point pretty explicitly in The Descent of Man. So he thinks that the primitives what he calls primitive races or savages and such. He thought that they didn't have as high a moral, had not had as much high moral progress as the Europeans as well.
Okay, we began by talking a little bit about evolutionary ethics. That's in your subtitle for From Darwin to Hitler. If the basic evolutionary ethic is survival and propagation of your particular DNA and genotype, and if that's the case, then what is morality? Where does that come from?
Well, I think you're right to raise that question. And in fact, I think there's a tension between their belief that morality has arisen through these mindless processes that doesn't provide any objectivity for morality. And this is one point I make in a whole chapter of my book. I point out that this tends toward moral relativism.
Right.
And Darwin himself actually says this in his autobiography. He actually says at one point in the autobiography that if someone believes these ideas, then there really isn't any fixed morality. However, Darwin, being the good Victorian that he was, thought that if people followed their social instincts that he thought that they would actually follow the golden rule to love your neighbor as yourself. He actually says this very explicitly. However, he doesn't have any moral fulcrum to condemn anyone that would go off on any other kind of moral, would reject that kind of morality and push for any other kind of morality. So Hitler, for example. Of course, there's things between Darwin and Hitler. In my book, From Darwin to Hitler, most of the book is not about Darwin or Hitler. Most of the book is actually about a lot of German Darwinists, social thinkers, historians, and others who were writing about Darwinism and what they saw as its impact on human society. And many of them did believe that it promoted the right of the stronger to survive, and that was a good thing, that should be promoted, and whether it be stronger individual within society or the stronger races as they saw it.
Okay, this was what is fascinating in your book, is that many of these German Darwinists are names and individuals whose work will be unknown to most people in the United States. Describe a couple of them, at least, and their work.
Well, probably the most famous one, and the one that might be familiar a little bit to a few people who are at least into the history of science, and such as Ernst Haeckel, who was the leading Darwinist in Germany in the late 19th and early 20th century.
He did those famous or infamous sketches.
Embryo drawings, right. Yes, where he used the same woodcut to represent different ones and was called on it later on. But Haeckel also did a very interesting drawing that I have in my book, From Darwin to Hitler, where he had 6 different human races sort of on a scale, and then 6 simian species below them, and it's supposed to be a continuum. And so what Haeckel says about this particular illustration with these 12, again, 6 human races, 6 simian species, is that the distance between the highest of the humans and the lowest of the humans is greater than the distance between the lowest humans and the highest of the apes. And so in this particular diagram, he has the lowest of the humans being an Australian Aborigine, and then he drew these himself, I think, if I recall correctly, and he has the simian species looking almost facially like the Australian Aborigine. So the idea is that the apes and the primitive humans are very close. And Haeckel not only did that with his sketch, but he also, in the book itself, argued that there were 10 different human species. He divided the races into species. There were 10 different human species. At times he actually caught about 12, but in this book, 10.
And ranked them.
Yes, and ranked them. Yes, he believed that the Europeans were superior.
You're right. I was going to say, here's the trick question. Which race is on top? I would.
And the Australian Aborigines were on the bottom.
Right. This brings us to there is a horrifying story in your book about an individual who wasn't an Australian Aborigine, but he was a pygmy named Ota Benga. Mm-hmm. Why is that relevant in drawing the connection between Darwin and Hitler?
Yeah, Ota Benga actually is a thing I discuss in a different of my books, in the Death of Humanity, not in From Darwin to Hitler. But he's relevant because he illustrates that it wasn't just the Germans, too, but also the Americans. Ota Benga was an African pygmy who was brought to the United States, and he was actually put on display first at the St. Louis World Fair, but then later in the Brooklyn Zoo. And he was put on display as basically a link between the apes and humans. And so these African pygmies were looked at as being some kind of, not really missing link because they're not missing, but being a link between apes and humans.
Did Haeckel and the other German Darwinists, did they also believe that human beings of different races had evolved from different simian ancestors? In other words, that orangutans were the progenitors of Asian people, and gorillas and chimpanzees. That was part of their notion too, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was not Haeckel's particular idea, but there were German Darwinists, yes, that were teaching that. So there were differences of opinion over whether they had evolved from a single simian species or multiple simian species. But yes, some of them did try to break them up even further.
Does anyone believe that today?
Not that I'm aware of. No, not that I'm aware of.
Right. Okay. So you have these hideous ideas. How did they get passed on to Adolf Hitler during his formative years of putting together what became the Nazi philosophy?
Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of information about Hitler's early education, so we don't know a lot of detail. But actually, in one of his monologues, he does talk about the fact that when he was in school, that he was taught in his science classes evolution. He says this very clearly. He's taught about human evolution in his science classes. But then he also remarked that in his religion classes, he was taught something different. And he said that he took the side of the science over the religion in those particular disputes that were going on. So from his own telling of the story later on, it's hard to know how much to believe of that, of what Hitler said later about his own life. But from his telling the story later on, he learned it in school, which is most probable anyway, because most German schools by the late 19th and early 20th century, when Hitler would have been in school, were teaching biological evolution, including the evolution of humans. And if you look at German biologists at the time, ideas today, such as scientific racism, that today is taboo, at the time they were considered good science.
Okay, now right now we would think that scientific racism would be an oxymoron. But
right.
This was a great preoccupation for scientists, not just in Germany, but in Great Britain and to some extent in the United States, which brings us to this question of eugenics. How did the Nazi fascination with, an obsession with eugenics, of proper breeding to build a better kind of human being, how did that initiate?
Well, interestingly, the whole movement of eugenics began through Francis Galton, who was Darwin's cousin, and he got the idea while he was reading Darwin's Origin of Species. He says this himself. The idea was that if there's this struggle for existence going on, and there's all these variations that are out there, that we as humans now have the ability to choose which variations should survive. And so we can choose the traits we want.
Horses,
sure,
right?
Exactly. That's exactly what they said. Yeah, they actually say this quite often. Yeah, we breed those. And Darwin himself said this about we wouldn't even leave to chance the way we do with breeding humans, our breeding of animals. So this idea originated with Francis Galton and then was picked up by a lot of German biologists. And in fact, by the early 20th century, Germany was on the forefront of the eugenics movement, pushing for compulsory sterilization, other kinds of things. Now, the United States actually ended up enacting some of the first compulsory sterilization laws in the world to try to breed better humans. But Germany had some of the most vigorous scientific programs in place, trying to investigate it, write about it, and such, which is why a lot of American investors like Carnegie and such were plowing money into the German eugenics movement because there was a lot going on there. So Hitler, there was a lot of eugenics propaganda throughout Germany, Austria, while Hitler was growing up. And so it was very easy for him to find this propaganda in the press, in various books. There was a publisher named Julius Lehmann who actually became a friend of Hitler's when he was in Munich, who published a lot of eugenics material and sent Hitler the books. He was publishing stuff on scientific racism as well. And he would send Hitler books. We have inscribed copies still in Hitler's library. It's in the that's in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. right now, where Julius Lehmann sent these books to Hitler. So Hitler had lots of opportunity to read books about eugenics and scientific racism.
Okay, eugenics, scientific racism. How does that get transmogrified into the Nazi ideology that we know that was advanced, for instance, in Mein Kampf?
Well, the idea was that since human races are in a struggle for existence, that this means that there's this competition going on between them. And of course, one of the elements of Hitler's ideology was that the Aryan or Nordic race, and those terms were used synonymously, that they were the highest race, and that ultimately he thought they were going to outcompete the other races. But of course, he wants to help things along. And so he's trying to better the Aryan race by getting rid of those that he considers unfit. So this is where he begins this program of trying to kill people with disabilities. Well, they first began compulsory sterilization. The Nazis in 1933 began a massive compulsory sterilization project that ended up compulsorily sterilizing 1 out of every 200 Germans in the first 6 years of the Nazi regime. And then in 1939, they changed that program into an out-and-out killing program for people with disabilities. And over the next 6 years, by the end of World War II, they had killed about 200,000 disabled Germans, as well as countless tens of thousands of people with disabilities in occupied countries as well. But then the racial issue, then they're wanting to also purify the race and get rid of those that identify as inferior races as part of the struggle for existence. And so that's where then they try to destroy the Jews, the Gypsies, and ultimately it would have taken on other races as well, the Slavs and others along the way.
Germany in the late 19th century, early 20th century had the reputation, at least, as being the world leader in scientific theory, scientific investigation, research. Wasn't there some resistance to these ideas of scientific racism?
Yeah, and interestingly, most of the opposition came from the Catholic Church. That was one of the biggest opponents of the scientific racism. But from the scientific community, very little opposition in the 1920s and 30s.
This is fascinating, and I'm very glad we have the opportunity to continue discussion with Professor Richard Weikart. His book, From Darwin to Hitler, is must-reading. It's as explosive and fascinating as his conversation. Now, if you want to continue this kind of conversation, you can do so not only by signing up and subscribing at mindswithmedved.com, but by thinking about contributing to support this kind of programming and this kind of investigation and conversation. Richard Weikart is also writing, and he's involved with Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture. Visit us at our website again, mindswithmedved.com, where you'll discover all sorts of easy ways to participate with us in this ongoing conversation. I'm Michael Medved, and I thank you.
Thanks for listening to Great Minds with Michael Medved, available at mindswithmedved.com. Great Minds with Michael Medved is produced by Jeremy Steiner and Greg Tomlin and is copyrighted by Discovery Institute 2018.